You drift in darkness. Not the kind you know from closing your eyes, but a darkness before anything existed, before stars, before oceans, before even the idea of time. You are weightless, voiceless, without a body, yet somehow you are there. And then it happens. One spark, one thought, bursting through the void like a ripple across still water. Creation begins. Galaxies swirl into being, dust gathers into suns, and in a quiet corner of the cosmos, a small blue world takes shape. You don't just watch this unfold, you are inside it, carried by it, pulled forward into the story it demands to tell. But tonight, the story isn't just about creation. It's about something harder to name, something more unsettling. If this infinite power made everything, the beauty, the wonder, even you, then did it also make what terrifies you? Did it make evil? That is the question you'll carry like a lantern through the darkness. For now, you arrive at the first chapter of the story, a garden. You feel soft earth beneath your bare feet. A breeze stirs leaves that shimmer with freshness you can almost taste, as if the air itself is untouched. No shame, no fear, no violence, just a hum of perfection all around you. This is Eden, and you, in this story, are its first inhabitant. Innocence clings to you as naturally as the light clings to morning. There is no choice to be good. You simply are, because bad does not yet exist. Here lies the puzzle. If all is good, where does evil come from? It cannot be picked like a fruit or carved like a stone. And yet, into this still perfection slips a shadow of possibility. Other peoples long before this tale wrestled with the same mystery. The Egyptians spoke of Apep, the serpent of chaos, forever trying to devour the sun. Unlike Ra, who created light, Apep was simply there, darkness that had always existed, demanding resistance. Evil to them wasn't created, it was eternal, a shadow baked into reality itself. But in Eden, the story is different. No eternal enemy lurks outside. There is only one creator, one power. Which means if evil appears, it must come from somewhere within the creation itself. So you are given a single command. One tree, one rule. Do not eat. The instructions seem simple, almost harmless, until the serpent arrives. It doesn't force your hand, doesn't strike with violence. It leans close with a question, a whisper. Did God really say? A seed of doubt takes root in the perfect soil. The first crack appears, not in the world around you, but inside you. Choice has entered the story. You are no machine, no puppet dancing on a string. You can decide. That gift, the freedom to walk left instead of right, to speak instead of stay silent, creates space for beauty, but also for ruin. You have the power to paint your life across this divine canvas, yet your hand trembles. The question is not whether the Creator made evil, but whether in giving you freedom, the Creator made room for it. And so, in this garden of stillness, the silence shifts. The stage is set not for a cosmic battle, but for the smallest of choices. One bite, one act of curiosity, one step away from perfection. And from that step, everything else will follow. That whisper still hangs in the air, so soft, so harmless, and yet it changes everything. Did God really say? It isn't a command, but an invitation to doubt. Like a single drop of ink falling into clear water, the question spreads until you cannot help but notice it. For the first time, you realize you don't just live inside the story, you can alter it. You stand there, staring at the fruit, your mind caught between obedience and curiosity. Before this moment, your goodness wasn't chosen, it was simply given. Like the innocence of a newborn, you didn't know anything else. But now, the possibility of something else stands before you. And in that possibility lies the birth of evil, not as a creature or a thing, but as the outcome of a choice. Cultures across the ancient world imagined this moment in their own way. The Greeks told of Pandora, entrusted with a box she must never open. She did, of course, and unleashed into the world every sorrow, disease, famine, jealousy, despair. Evil wasn't created that day. It had always been locked away, waiting for curiosity to set it free. Like Pandora, you too are not tempted by malice, but by the lure of knowledge, the hunger to see what lies on the other side of obedience. The serpent plays its role well. It doesn't strike, it doesn't shout, it suggests. It teases the possibility that what you've been told is not the whole story. It offers knowledge. Your eyes will be opened. You will be like God. This is no promise of cruelty, but of awakening. What is more tempting than the chance to know, to understand, to step beyond the limits you didn't ask to have? So you take the bite. The fruit is sweet on your tongue, but the sweetness curdles almost instantly. A new sensation grips you, something foreign, something heavy. Shame. For the first time, you notice your nakedness. You cover yourself, not from the animals or the trees, but from your own eyes. Perfection has been pierced. This shame is not a thing God placed in the world like a stone in the riverbed. It rises from within you, the consequence of your choice. A creation not of divine will, but of human freedom. This is the problem that philosophers have circled for millennia. If everything God made was good, then evil cannot be a thing He fashioned. Instead, it emerges when good is withheld, abandoned, or twisted. From this one act, the categories of existence change forever. There is now a before and an after. Before, you were innocent, untouched, untested. After, you are aware. You know not only good, but its absence. You know not only beauty, but the shadow cast when beauty is broken. And from this first fracture, all others will follow. The serpent fades from view, its work complete. It was never a co-creator of evil, only a voice that made you look at the edges of the story and wonder what might lie beyond them. The act was yours, and in choosing, you have opened a door that will never again close. Shame, fear, doubt, they pour through the crack like cold wind. And for the first time in all creation, you feel what it is to be unsettled, to be less than whole. The world has not collapsed, the sky has not fallen, and yet you know nothing will ever be the same. The story of evil has begun. The taste of the fruit fades, but its echo lingers. The garden that once felt like perfection now feels altered, as if the air itself has grown heavier. Nothing visible has changed. The trees still sway, the river still runs, but inside you, something new has taken root. Shame, self-consciousness, a weight you can't set down. And soon, that inner fracture spreads outward. For the first time, the world feels fragile. The hum of perfection is gone, replaced by unease. Evil has entered, not as a monstrous figure, not as a shadow stalking the trees, but as the quiet consequence of a choice. It doesn't take long before that inner crack becomes a chasm. The first ripple of human malice against another comes in the story of two brothers, Cain and Abel. Abel tends sheep, Cain tills the soil. Both bring their offerings, but only Abel's is accepted. Why? The story doesn't tell you clearly. Perhaps Abel gave with sincerity, while Cain gave half-heartedly. Whatever the reason, the rejection burns. Cain feels the familiar seed of shame and twists it into envy, and envy into rage. God warns him, sin is crouching at your door. Its desire is for you, but you must rule over it. Notice that Sin isn't described as a thing you can touch, but as a predator waiting for permission, a choice waiting to be made. Cain opens the door. He lures Abel into a field, and with his own hands spills the first blood. This is different from Eden. Eve's choice was curious, almost innocent, reaching for knowledge. Cain's act is deliberate, born of jealousy and fury. It is not temptation from outside that drives him, it is the storm inside his own chest. And here lies something darker. Evil is no longer only a possibility. It has become a reality, expressed in violence. The story of Cain and Abel births the idea of what later generations would call original sin. The stain is not just on one person, not just on one moment. It's in everyone after, like a crack in the foundation passed down from parent to child. You don't choose to inherit it, it's already in the marrow of your being. You arrive in the world not as a blank slate, but as a smudged one. Some, however, saw it differently. The early Christian Gnostics reimagined Eden itself. To them, the serpent was not the villain, but the liberator. They believed the God of Genesis was not the ultimate divine being, but a lesser, jealous craftsman trying to keep humanity ignorant. In their telling, the fruit wasn't the source of evil, but the gateway to truth. A daring inversion. What if what tradition calls bad was actually the first act of freedom? But even if you reframe the story, the consequences remain. The world outside Eden is no longer safe or stable. Nature itself turns hostile. Floods, famine, and disease now stalk humanity as much as envy and rage. It isn't just that you make bad choices, it's that creation itself seems cracked, groaning under the weight of your fall. Think of a thread pulled from a woven garment. One tug doesn't ruin just the thread, it loosens the whole fabric. In the same way, the first act of disobedience didn't just alter a single moment, it rewrote the entire system. From now on, suffering is part of the story, baked into the very soil you walk upon. And yet, here lies the paradox. If evil is woven into life after Eden, does that mean it was always a possibility within the design itself? If a perfect God built a world where freedom could break it, doesn't that mean the fracture was already in the blueprint? The question grows louder, more insistent, and once again, you're left standing at the threshold, asking, if God made everything, did he also make this? The ground is no longer steady beneath your feet. After Cain's act, the world feels less like a paradise and more like a battlefield. Yet not everyone has explained evil in the same way. Long before Eden's story was told, civilizations were already wrestling with chaos, suffering, and injustice. Their answers looked very different from the one you've carried so far. Step now into Mesopotamia, the land between rivers, the cradle of cities, writing, and myth. Dust clings to your sandals as you walk streets lined with clay brick and the smell of baking bread. Voices rise in the marketplace, prayers echo in temples, and everywhere hangs the awareness of how fragile life truly is. The same rivers that give life can also destroy it with sudden, violent floods. Crops fail, neighbors wage war. In this world, evil is not an afterthought, it's expected. Their myths reflect it. The Enuma Elish, their great creation story, begins not with peace, but with conflict. At its heart is Tiamat, the primordial saltwater chaos. She is not evil in a moral sense, she is simply untamed, dangerous, uncontrollable. Against her rises the young god Marduk, who defeats her, splits her vast body in two, and fashions the heavens and earth from her remains. Humanity itself, according to the tale, is created from the blood of a defeated demon. From the very start, human life is born from conflict, violence, and compromise. In this worldview, evil isn't a glitch. It isn't something that snuck in through a back door. It is part of the very fabric of existence. The gods themselves are flawed, impulsive, and quarrelsome. If a famine strikes, it isn't because you sinned, it's because a god is angry, distracted, or losing a battle elsewhere. Suffering is simply the consequence of living in a world ruled by capricious powers. There's a strange comfort in this. If evil is just baked into the universe, then you are not uniquely to blame. You are not born under the shadow of some ancestral mistake. Instead, you're caught in a cosmic crossfire. Your role is not to solve the problem of evil, but to survive it through sacrifice, ritual, and appeasement. Consider the demons of Mesopotamian lore. There was Pazuzu, the demon of the southwest wind, bringer of famine and plague. Others haunted households, rivers, and crossroads. Amulets were worn, incantations whispered, rituals performed, all in the hope of warding off forces that were everywhere, pressing at the edges of life. Evil wasn't hidden inside your heart, it prowled outside, waiting for gaps in your defenses. And so the people lived not with the burden of original sin, but with the anxiety of constant danger. The universe was not broken by one human act, it was born broken, a precarious balance between order and chaos. This perspective stands in sharp contrast to Eden's tale. Instead of asking why a good God allowed evil, the Mesopotamian story never expects goodness to rule unchallenged. The gods themselves are messy, so the world is messy too. Yet as you linger here among ziggurats and markets, the question stirs again. If evil is simply chaos, does that mean it has no moral weight? No personal responsibility? And if so, then what makes a choice good or bad at all? The garden asked you to consider freedom. Mesopotamia asks you to consider fate, and both answers feel incomplete. From the floodplains of Mesopotamia, you travel east to the highlands of ancient Persia. The air here is thin, dry, and filled with the scent of smoke from sacred fires. You stand before one of these flames, not a wildfire's devouring blaze, but a steady, luminous glow, a fire tended carefully by Zoroastrian priests. For them, this fire is not just warmth or light, it is truth itself, a symbol of order against the creeping dark. Here, the universe is not chaos alone, it is a battlefield. On one side stands Ahura Mazda, the wise Lord, radiant with goodness, light, and purity. On the other side waits Angra Mainyu, the destructive spirit, master of lies and darkness. This dualism offers a clean, simple answer. Evil is not something created by God. Evil is its own force, ancient and opposed, locked in struggle with the good. You feel the clarity of this vision. No philosophical gymnastics, no tangled paradox. Joy, kindness, truth, all flow from Ahura Mazda. Disease, violence, envy, all bear the mark of Angra Mainyu. Every moment of your life, every word you speak, every thought you entertain becomes a choice of allegiance. You are not just living, you are participating in a cosmic war. This view profoundly shaped the way later faiths imagined the world. The idea of a personal evil, a Satan figure, an adversary plotting against the good, owes much to these Persian roots. But in its own time, Zoroastrianism offered both reassurance and burden. The reassurance, God did not create evil, He is wholly good. The burden, good is not guaranteed to win. Consider their funerary practice, known as sky burial. Instead of burying the dead in the earth or burning them with fire, acts that would pollute the sacred elements, they placed bodies atop towers of silence, where birds of the sky would strip them clean. To the Zoroastrian mind, death was a stain of Angra Mainyu, something that must not infect the pure creations of Ahura Mazda. Even in death, you take your place in the cosmic balance of good and evil. There is a stark comfort in this dualism. The sufferings of life are not your fault. They are not evidence of a flawed creator or a broken design. They are simply the blows of an eternal enemy. When you fall sick, when you grieve, when you feel hatred stirring within you, it is Angra Mainyu pressing close. And when you act with love, when you keep a promise, when you choose generosity, it is Ahura Mazda shining through you. Yet this clarity comes with a chilling implication. If evil is its own eternal power, then can goodness ever triumph? Is this war endless, its victories only temporary? If Ahura Mazda is good but not all-powerful, then your hope is not in a final resolution, but in the fragile, daily struggle to side with the light. And so the Persian plains leave you with a new weight. Evil is not a mistake. It is not an absence. It is an adversary, forever clawing at the edges of the world. You are not guilty simply for existing. You are responsible because every breath you take is a choice in the battle. The garden asked you about freedom. Mesopotamia asked you about chaos. Persia asks you where you will stand when the flames flicker and the shadows stretch long. The Persian fire burns steady behind you as you sail west across the Mediterranean to a land of marble temples and restless seas. Here, on the slopes of Mount Olympus, thunder rattles the sky, not as a symbol of perfect order, but as the laughter, anger, and quarrels of gods who behave far too much like mortals. In Greece, the problem of evil takes on a different shape. There is no all-good, all-powerful creator to defend. Instead, there is a family of gods, glorious, immortal, and petty. Zeus pursues his endless affairs. Hera seethes with jealousy. Poseidon lashes out in storms when slighted. These deities are not paragons of virtue, but mirrors of human flaws magnified to cosmic scale. So when misfortune strikes, a plague devastates a city, or a hero is cursed, it isn't the fault of human disobedience or cosmic dualism. It is the fallout of divine squabbles. Consider the Trojan War. It began not with a grand moral failing, but with a beauty contest among three goddesses, each desperate to be named fairest. The outcome wasn't justice, it was jealousy, vanity, and wounded pride. And in its wake came years of slaughter. In this world, evil is less about morality and more about misalignment. You suffer not because you are inherently corrupt, nor because you've chosen the wrong side in a cosmic war, but because the gods themselves are unpredictable and easily offended. When things go wrong, you don't ask, why did a good God allow this? Instead, you wonder, which God did I anger and how can I make it right? There's a strange kind of relief in this. You are not born with original sin. You are not trapped in a duel between eternal forces. You are simply caught in the capricious drama of immortal beings. The weight of guilt is lighter. The weight of survival, however, is heavy. Think of the story of Echo and Narcissus. Echo, a nymph, is cursed by Hera to repeat only the words of others, punished not for wickedness, but for enabling Zeus's latest affair. Narcissus, cursed to fall in love with his own reflection, withers away not because he was evil, but because a slighted god demanded retribution. These fates are cruel, but not moral. They are collateral damage in divine disputes. And yet, out of this messiness, something remarkable grows. If the gods are unreliable, then perhaps answers must come from within humanity itself. Philosophy flourishes. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, all seeking rational, human-centered explanations for the world. Logic, ethics, virtue, these become the tools to navigate a reality where divine justice cannot be trusted. Still, the Greek cosmos offers its own quiet comfort. Suffering is not a test. It is not a punishment for being flawed. It is not the work of an eternal evil. It is simply life in a world ruled by beings as imperfect as you are. And so, from Greece, you carry a new lesson. Evil may not always be moral at all. Sometimes it is simply the collateral of power, the price of living in a universe where gods play games with human lives. The garden asked you about freedom. Mesopotamia asked you about chaos. Persia asked you about battle. Greece asks you whether morality itself is an illusion, a fragile construct in a world governed not by justice, but with whim. The voices of Olympus fade, their quarrels echoing faintly behind you. Now you step into a different world entirely, a world where people insist there is not a pantheon of flawed deities, but one God, all-powerful, all-good, and deeply invested in creation. This conviction sharpens the problem of evil into its most piercing form. For if God is perfect, then why is the world filled with suffering? You find yourself in ancient Rome. The streets are alive with clattering carts, merchants calling out, incense burning at crowded shrines. Among the temples of countless gods, a new voice rises, a small group whispering about one God, not many. A God who loves, a God who promises life beyond death. This message spreads like fire, igniting hope. But then a plague sweeps through the city, or persecution begins, and believers are dragged into arenas to die. The question returns with brutal force. If God loves you, why is He silent while you suffer? The early Christians turn again to the garden for answers. They speak of free will. Love that is coerced is not love at all, they argue. If God wanted creatures who could truly love Him, He had to give them the ability to refuse Him. And with that freedom comes the possibility of disobedience, cruelty, and destruction. The fault lies not with the Creator, but with the creature. It's a powerful answer, especially when it comes to human-caused evil. Wars, betrayals, lies, all these can be traced to choices made freely. But what of natural disasters? Earthquakes, famines, diseases? What choice brought those? Some Christians turn again to the idea of the fall. When humanity broke its harmony with God, creation itself was wounded. The soil that once yielded bread now yields thorns. The body that once knew only life now suffers disease. Even the natural world bears the scar of that first disobedience. Still, this doesn't erase the anguish of martyrs facing lions or families mourning children lost to plague. Another explanation arises: spiritual enemies. The serpent of Eden grows in the imagination into demons, invisible forces working mischief in the world. These beings are not equals to God. They are fallen, twisted echoes of what was once good. Yet they add another dimension to suffering. Some pain is not from nature or choice, but from powers bent on corruption. This vision helps many endure. If your suffering is not meaningless, but part of a larger struggle, you can bear it differently. To die for your faith is not just tragedy, but testimony. To resist temptation is not just a personal victory, but a cosmic one. And yet, the problem remains stubborn. If God could stop these evils, why doesn't He? If He loves His children, why does He allow their agony? The early Christians wrestle with this question in their writings, their prayers, their hymns. And out of their struggle emerges the beginnings of what theologians would call theodicy, the attempt to justify God's goodness in a world so saturated with pain. The garden asked you about freedom. Mesopotamia asked you about chaos. Persia asked you about war. Greece asked you about whim. Now Rome asks you to wrestle with love itself. Whether love can exist without the possibility of its rejection, and whether suffering might somehow fit into the story of a God who still claims to be good. The streets of Rome fall quiet, and now you find yourself in the company of one of its greatest minds, Augustine of Hippo. Once a restless seeker, even a follower of the Manichaeans with their belief in two eternal forces locked in battle, Augustine eventually abandoned dualism. For him, there could not be two equal powers, one of light and one of darkness. There could be only one creator, and he was good. So where did evil fit in? Augustine's answer still echoes across centuries. Evil is not a thing at all. It is not a substance, not an entity, not a force. It is a privation, a lack. Like a hole in a garment, evil exists only in the absence of something that should be there. Goodness is the fabric, evil is the tear. Imagine a painter at work on a canvas. She does not need a bucket of black paint labeled evil. The shadows form when she leaves certain spaces untouched. For Augustine, God is the painter. His creation is wholly good. Where evil appears, it is not because God mixed a new color, but because a creature turned away from the light and left a void. This was not only a philosophical answer, but a personal one. Augustine saw his own life as evidence. He once chased pleasures, ambitions, desires he later called sinful. But he came to see that he had not been embracing some independent force called evil. He had been turning away from the good that was always there, choosing emptiness over fullness. It's a subtle but profound shift. The question is not, why did God create evil? But why do creatures fail to embrace the good? The burden is placed back on human shoulders, not as condemnation, but as recognition of responsibility. Consider the weight this view gives to every act. When you perform kindness, you add to the substance of good in the world. When you withhold it, when you harm, you do not empower some rival force. You diminish what should have been, leaving a hole. Evil is not strong, it is fragile, a parasite feeding on what it cannot create. And yet, Augustine's brilliance raises new questions. If evil is only absence, why does it feel so real, so heavy, so powerful? Tell a mother burying her child that her grief is only a privation, and the words feel hollow. Tell a people crushed by tyranny that their suffering is merely a lack of good, and you may hear laughter or despair. Still, Augustine's vision endures because it defends a perfect God without surrendering to dualism. God creates only good. Evil arises only when creation turns away. The consequence is stark. If there is a hole in the fabric, it is because the creature dropped the needle. The garden asked you about freedom. Mesopotamia asked you about chaos. Persia asked you about war. Greece asked you about whim. Rome asked you about love. Augustine now asks you about absence, whether what you call evil is real at all, or simply the shadow cast when good is missing. Centuries pass. Augustine's words ripple outward, carried through monasteries, universities, and sermons. But as the Middle Ages deepen, the question refuses to stay quiet. If evil is only absence, then why does it so often feel like a presence, active, cunning, and deliberate? Why do stories of demons, witches, and devils stir such terror? You walk now through a medieval village at dusk. The air is thick with wood smoke and the lowing of cattle. Candles flicker in cottage windows. Beneath the ordinary rhythms of life hums a constant unease. The belief that darkness is not merely the absence of light, but a prowling adversary. The devil, once a serpent whispering in a garden, now looms large in imagination, a prince of lies, orchestrating ruin with deliberate malice. This is the age of cosmic drama. Plays performed in churchyards depict not just saints and angels, but grotesque demons clawing at souls. Preachers thunder about hellfire, warning of Satan's snares. Evil is not simply a hole in the fabric, it is a hand pulling at the threads. Think of the Black Death. Whole towns emptied, families buried in mass graves. For many, this was not explained by germs, but by judgment, or worse, by demonic attack. Satan and his servants were thought to stalk the earth in tangible ways, bringing plague, famine, and war. Augustine's elegant privation faltered under the weight of such relentless suffering. The people wanted not philosophy, but enemies to name and fight. And so, the medieval imagination filled with monsters, dragons, spirits, witches, symbols of the belief that evil was an active force. The Inquisition rose, hunting heresy as if heretics were the devil's soldiers. Witch trials followed, fueled by the conviction that Satan was not an absence, but a rival king building his own kingdom. Yet, even in this climate, scholars tried to reconcile the paradox. Thomas Aquinas, echoing Augustine, insisted that evil had no substance of its own. It was still the twisting of good. Even Satan, he argued, was not created as a demon, but as a glorious angel who chose rebellion. God had made him good. He had made himself evil. Thus, even the devil's power was parasitic, feeding on what God had already made. This blend of philosophy and fear created a world haunted by both absence and presence. Evil was nothing, and yet it was everywhere. A missing good, and yet a stalking predator. For the common villager, the nuance hardly mattered. What they knew was that the night was dangerous, the woods held terrors, and their souls were always at risk. Evil was not a distant abstraction. It was close, immediate, clawing at the edges of every life. The garden asked you about freedom. Mesopotamia asked you about chaos. Persia asked you about war. Greece asked you about whim. Rome asked you about love. Augustine asked you about absence. Now, the Middle Ages ask you to confront presence, the terrifying sense that evil may not be an emptiness at all, but a shadow with teeth. The medieval night fades into dawn. Cathedrals rise higher, stained glass spilling light across stone floors, yet shadows remain. The age of scholastic debate gives way to reform, upheaval, and new voices daring to challenge the old answers. Now the question of evil sharpens once more, not in dusty monasteries, but in the chaos of wars, plagues, and revolutions. You stand in the 16th century as Martin Luther hammers his theses to a church door. His voice is fierce, unyielding. For him, evil is not an abstract lack, but a power woven into the human condition. Sin clings to you, he argues, not just as a possibility, but as a certainty. You are not free to choose perfectly. Your will itself is bent. Without God's grace, you cannot escape. This is a darker vision than Augustine's absence or Aquinas' parasitic shadow. Here, evil is a corruption so deep it warps even your freedom. To Luther, the garden was not just the site of a bad choice, it was the moment when choice itself was wounded. From then on, every human heart leans toward rebellion, like a compass needle magnetized toward sin. From this flows another implication. If you are not free to escape evil by effort, then salvation cannot come from you. It must come as a gift. Grace alone, faith alone. And so evil becomes not just a philosophical puzzle, but the backdrop against which divine mercy shines. Others take the question further. John Calvin insists that God's sovereignty is absolute. If God allows evil, it is not by accident, but by design. Not that he delights in cruelty, but that even evil bends to his purposes. To the reformers, there is no stray thread in the tapestry. Every suffering, every sorrow, every act of malice is somehow, mysteriously, woven into a larger plan. This raises a harsher paradox. If God is good, yet ordains all things, then evil itself must serve his will. Wars, diseases, betrayals, none happen outside his providence. For some, this vision brings comfort. No chaos, no randomness, no Mesopotamian quarrels among careless gods. Everything has meaning. For others, it is unbearable. If God weaves even cruelty, then does he not become complicit in it? Meanwhile, beyond the walls of churches, the world itself grows darker. The 30 Years' War drenches Europe in blood. Cities burn, fields rot, famine spreads. To the soldiers marching, the widows mourning, the peasants starving, Augustine's privation or Aquinas's parasiticism sound like distant abstractions. Evil is not absence, it is present, in the smoke of villages, the cries of children, the silence of God. Yet through this darkness, new voices begin to ask whether the old frame is even enough. What if evil is not only about sin and rebellion? What if it is also about human cruelty, unchecked ambition, the grinding machinery of war? Slowly, philosophy begins to step out from under theology, daring to ask questions on its own terms. And so, as the Reformation and its aftermath shake Europe, the story of evil takes another turn. The garden asked you about freedom. Mesopotamia asked you about chaos. Persia asked you about war. Greece asked you about whim. Rome asked you about love. Augustine asked you about absence. The Middle Ages asked you about presence. Now the Reformation asks you about corruption, whether evil is not simply what you do, but what you are born already inclined to do. The wars of religion are quiet, but the smoke never fully clears. Out of the rubble, new thinkers rise, not priests in pulpits, but philosophers at desks, armed not with scripture, but with reason. This is the Enlightenment, the age of inquiry, when minds dared to believe that with observation and logic they could chart the universe itself. And with this daring comes a sharper question. If God is good and all-powerful, why does the world remain so full of misery? You sit now in a candle-lit study, papers scattered across a wooden desk. Here is Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, who insists on a bold answer. This is the best of all possible worlds. God, being perfect, would not create a flawed design. Every sorrow, every tragedy, every evil you witness is, in some hidden way, necessary to achieve the greatest possible good. You may not see it, but the larger tapestry is flawless. It's an idea both comforting and cruel. Comforting because it means suffering is not meaningless. Cruel because it demands you accept horrors as part of perfection. To Leibniz, the Lisbon earthquake of 1755, which leveled a city and killed tens of thousands, must somehow have been part of this best world. To the survivors, his words sound like mockery. Voltaire, outraged, takes up his pen. In his biting satire Candide, he mocks the optimism of Leibniz's disciples. All is for the best, they insist, even as they endure war, disaster, and betrayal. Voltaire refuses such neat answers. To him, evil is not a philosophical puzzle to be solved, but a reality to be confronted, resisted, and, when possible, alleviated. He will not wrap a ribbon of divine necessity around the graves of innocents. Others echo his challenge. David Hume, skeptical and razor-sharp, presses the dilemma into a single brutal formula. If God is willing to prevent evil but not able, he is weak. If he is able but not willing, he is malevolent. If he is both able and willing, whence then comes evil? For Hume, the problem is not a mystery to be harmonized, but evidence against the very idea of a perfectly good creator. And so the Enlightenment pulls the question out of theology's cloister and places it squarely in the open forum of reason. Theodicy becomes less about defending God and more about testing whether belief in such a God can withstand the evidence of the world. But here too lies danger. If evil is nothing more than random misfortune, then morality itself begins to tremble. If there is no higher purpose, no divine order, what anchors the difference between right and wrong? If all is a chance, why be good at all? The Enlightenment does not silence the question, it fractures it. Some hold fast to faith, seeing in reason the tools to refine their understanding of God. Others abandon theodicy altogether, convinced the problem itself proves too heavy for belief to carry. The garden asked you about freedom. Mesopotamia asked you about chaos. Persia asked you about war. Greece asked you about whim. Rome asked you about love. Augustine asked you about absence. The Middle Ages asked you about presence. The Reformation asked you about corruption. The Enlightenment now asks you about reason, whether the human mind can justify evil at all, or whether evil is the splinter that shatters every neat system it touches. The Enlightenment's candlelight fades, but the question of evil does not dim. If anything, it grows sharper in the centuries that follow, as human cruelty rises not only from accidents of nature or quarrels of gods, but from human hands themselves, hands wielding machines, rifles, and ideologies. The 19th century dawns, and with it, new ways of understanding suffering. Philosophers, poets, and revolutionaries look less to heaven and more to earth for answers. You stand in a library as Immanuel Kant, stern and methodical, lays out his vision. For Kant, evil is not chaos, not corruption of the will beyond repair, but something deliberate, the choice to place self-interest above moral duty. Evil is not ignorance, it is a decision, to know the good and to prefer yourself anyway. It is a sober view, one that makes every human responsible. Evil cannot be excused as fate or flaw, it is chosen. But even Kant, with his confidence in human reason, cannot solve the deeper riddle. Why would anyone choose against the good if they truly understood it? Others take the question in darker directions. G.W.F. Hegel sees history itself as the stage where suffering and conflict press humanity forward toward freedom. To him, even tragedy is not meaningless. It is part of a dialectic, a process that grinds painfully but purposefully. Evil is not the end of the story, it is the crucible that shapes it. But then comes Friedrich Nietzsche, who explodes the entire framework. For him, good and evil are not eternal categories handed down by heaven, but human inventions, tools of control. Morality itself, he argues, is a construct, a cage built to restrain strength, vitality, and will. If you want to understand evil, Nietzsche urges, you must first admit that the terms themselves are suspect. Perhaps what we call evil is simply power unashamed of itself, and what we call good is weakness masking as virtue. His words strike like lightning, unsettling and liberating. They unsettle because they strip away comfort, the idea of cosmic justice, a final balancing, or a benevolent order. They liberate because they free humanity to create meaning for itself, rather than bowing to categories inherited from religion. But in their wake lies a frightening question. If morality is an illusion, what remains to restrain cruelty? As the century closes, literature too wrestles with this tension. Dostoevsky's characters cry out against the suffering of children, unable to reconcile their agony with any supposed divine plan. In The Brothers Karamazov, Ivan poses his devastating challenge. Even if eternal harmony exists, can it ever justify the tears of one innocent child? If heaven itself requires such a price, Ivan says, he would return his ticket. And so the 19th century leaves you with yet another shift. Evil is no longer something only theologians defend God against. It is a human, social, philosophical, even existential weight. It forces you to ask not only what God allows, but what you allow. The garden asked you about freedom. Mesopotamia asked you about chaos. Persia asked you about war. Greece asked you about whim. Rome asked you about love. Augustine asked you about absence. The Middle Ages asked you about presence. The Reformation asked you about corruption. The Enlightenment asked you about reason. Now, the 19th century asks you about morality itself. Whether good and evil are eternal truths or fragile human inventions, always in danger of unraveling. The 19th century's debates give way to a 20th century drenched in blood. The problem of evil is no longer an abstract question for philosophers in quiet studies. It erupts in trenches, camps, and cities reduced to ash. 2 world wars, the Holocaust, nuclear devastation. The scale of human cruelty and suffering expands beyond what imagination can easily bear. You stand amid the ruins of Europe in 1945. The streets are rubble, smoke rises from collapsed buildings, and silence lingers over fields where millions have perished. Here, the old answers feel brittle. Augustine's privation, Aquinas' parasitic shadow, Leibniz's best of all possible worlds, these ring hollow against the mountains of corpses. The question presses harder than ever. If God is good and powerful, how could Auschwitz exist? Philosophers and theologians grapple desperately. Some, like Karl Barth, insist that evil is not part of God's plan at all, but a terrifying, senseless disruption, something irrational, without explanation, and never to be justified. Others, like Jürgen Moltmann, propose that God is not distant from suffering, but enters it, shares it, bears it. At the cross, God himself suffers. In Auschwitz, he suffers again. Evil is not explained away, it is joined. Meanwhile, others abandon theodicy altogether. Jean-Paul Sartre, shaped by the war, declares that there is no God to account for good or evil. Humanity is alone, condemned to freedom, forced to create meaning in a world indifferent to suffering. Evil, then, is not a cosmic problem, but a human responsibility. It exists because of what people do, and only people can confront it. Hannah Arendt, watching Adolf Eichmann on trial, coins the phrase, the banality of evil. Evil, she says, is not always monstrous or demonic. Sometimes it is shockingly ordinary. A bureaucrat stamping papers, following orders, refusing to think. The Holocaust was not carried out by a few fanatics alone, but by thousands of ordinary people doing their jobs. This insight is chilling because it strips away the comfort of distance. Evil is not out there, in devils or fate. It is near, mundane, possible in anyone who stops questioning. And yet, in the aftermath of such horrors, faith does not vanish. In the ashes, some cling more tightly, insisting that even in suffering, God is present, even if unseen. Others, like Elie Wiesel, refuse such consolation. In his memoir Night, he recalls watching a child hanged in a concentration camp, his small body struggling on the rope, and hearing a voice within him cry out, "Where is God now?" The answer came, "Here he is, hanging on the gallows." For Wiesel, theodicy is not solved, it is shattered. The 20th century forces you to face evil not as a distant philosophical puzzle, but a daily reality written in ash and blood. It is no longer enough to ask, why did God allow this? The question becomes, how will humanity keep this from happening again? The garden asked you about freedom. Mesopotamia asked you about chaos. Persia asked you about war. Greece asked you about whim. Rome asked you about love. Augustine asked you about absence. The Middle Ages asked you about presence. The Reformation asked you about corruption. The Enlightenment asked you about reason. The 19th century asked you about morality. The 20th century now asks you about survival. Whether the problem of evil is not just theological, but the most urgent human question of all. The smoke of the 20th century has not yet cleared. And already the 21st confronts its own shadows. Terrorism, genocide, pandemics, climate disasters. The headlines remind you that the question of evil is not confined to ancient gardens or medieval sermons. It lives, raw and present, in every generation. But something shifts in the way people speak of it now. The age of grand systems, where philosophers or theologians claim to offer a single solution, feels over. Instead, you hear a chorus of voices, each wrestling with fragments of the question. Evil, it seems, is too vast for one answer alone. Some return to free will. They argue that the gift of freedom, though dangerous, is the only soil in which love can grow. Without choice, you are no more than a machine. Yes, freedom makes violence possible, but it also makes kindness, sacrifice, and creativity possible. To erase evil, God would have to erase love as well. Others return to suffering itself and wonder if pain has meaning. From a biological view, suffering can sharpen survival, warning the body, teaching resilience. From a spiritual view, suffering can deepen compassion, drawing people together. Theologians like John Hick describe this as soul-making, a process by which the hardships of life shape you into beings capable of growth, depth, and love that shallow perfection could never produce. But critics reply with fury. Tell the parent of a starving child that their grief is soul-making, and the words curdle. If suffering shapes character, why is so much of it random, senseless, crushing? If some lessons are worth the pain, surely others are unbearable, unjustifiable. And so modern thinkers wrestle with mystery. Some, like process theologians, suggest that God is not all-powerful in the way tradition imagined. Perhaps he does not stand above the world as an omnipotent king, but works within it as a fellow struggler, guiding, healing, persuading, but never forcing. Evil exists not because God allows it, but because God cannot simply erase it. Others go further still, abandoning God altogether. In a secular frame, evil becomes the name for human cruelty, systemic injustice, and natural indifference. Earthquakes kill without intent. Viruses spread without malice. What remains is not a cosmic battle, but a human one, whether you will confront suffering with apathy or with action. Yet even here, the haunting question remains. If evil is merely human, why does it feel so much larger, so weighty, so cosmic in scale? Why does it echo in myth, in poetry, in nightmares across all cultures and centuries? Why do you sense, in its presence, not just error or accident, but something profound, something that presses against the edges of existence itself? Perhaps the truth is that no single answer will ever suffice. Perhaps evil is too woven into the fabric of freedom, too tied to the risk of love, too tangled in the nature of a fragile world. Perhaps it is not something to be solved once and for all, but something to be endured, confronted, resisted, in every age, in every life. The garden asked you about freedom. Mesopotamia asked you about chaos. Persia asked you about war. Greece asked you about whim. Rome asked you about love. Augustine asked you about absence. The Middle Ages asked you about presence. The Reformation asked you about corruption. The Enlightenment asked you about reason. The 19th century asked you about morality. The 20th asked you about survival. And now, the 21st asks you about responsibility. Whether you will meet evil as an abstract riddle or as a call to act, here and now. Night falls again, though this time it feels less like an ending and more like a return. You lie beneath a sky alive with stars, the same stars that once looked down on Mesopotamian priests, Persian firekeepers, Greek philosophers, Roman martyrs, medieval villagers, reformers, and skeptics. All of them asked the same question that still lingers on your lips. If God created everything, Did he also create evil? You have walked the garden where freedom first cracked perfection. You stood in Babylon where chaos was the raw material of existence. You listened to Persia where two forces clashed eternally. You climbed Olympus where whim ruled instead of justice. You followed Augustine, who called evil absence. You watched the Middle Ages give it teeth. You heard reformers call it corruption. Philosophers test it with reason. Novelists cry against it, and survivors whisper its reality in ash and silence. And still, the question remains. Perhaps it always will. Perhaps it is less a riddle to be solved than a wound to be carried. For every answer you've heard opens another door. If evil is absence, why does it feel present? If it is freedom, why is it so devastating? If it is chaos, why do we sense malice? If it is malice, why do we find compassion rising even in its midst? Lying there, you realize something startling. The question itself has shaped humanity as much as any answer. To ask why suffering exists is to refuse to accept it blindly. It is to demand meaning, to search for justice, to insist that cruelty is not the final word. The problem of evil may never be solved, but it has never left you passive. It has driven poets to write, prophets to cry out, philosophers to reason, and ordinary people to resist. And maybe that is its paradoxical gift. The presence of evil reveals the depth of your hunger for good. You rage against injustice only because you believe in justice. You grieve cruelty only because you believe kindness should exist. You name suffering wrong because somewhere within you burns the unshakable sense that things should be right. If God created everything, perhaps He did not create evil as a thing, but created a world where freedom, risk, and love make it possible. Or perhaps the universe itself holds mysteries no system can contain. Either way, you are left with the choice that has always been yours, not to solve evil once and for all, but to decide how you will face it. Will you echo Cain, letting envy turn to violence? Or will you echo Abel, offering what good you can, even if the world rejects it? Will you see suffering and shrug, or will you see it and act? The stars above you give no clear answer. They shine as they always have, silent, indifferent, eternal. Yet beneath them, you feel something stir. Not certainty, not resolution, but resolve. Evil may never be explained, but goodness can always be chosen. And so, with the question still echoing in your mind, you let the night carry you toward sleep, where the oldest stories whisper, where the mysteries remain, and where tomorrow, once again, you will decide what kind of story you will write with your life.